Ivan Pavlenko, From Family to Family, Chapter 3, Part 1.1, The First Honeymoon, read by Natalia Buzova. After everything I had experienced, my first months in my native village could be called a honeymoon. It was as if I was born a second time and immediately plunged into the whirlpool of useful life. At that time, there were almost no boys of my age in the village. They either died in battles or were still somewhere in the army. Andrei Rigorovich Klunakiv Halivets returned from hospital a little earlier than me. Mihail Mykola Timofeyevich Simonchukov, who had not drafted into the army due to his health, was also at home. First, I went to Andrei. He was 1 year younger than me, so he had gone to the front in 1943, after the liberation of the village from the occupiers. He crossed the Dnieper, liberated Belarus, and was seriously wounded in the Baltic region. But he recovered and returned home. We hugged, kissed. His mother immediately put a bottle with alcohol and a snack on the table. We talked until late at night. We told each other how and where the war had been. And then we switched to village news. I learned from Andrei that the club was no longer closed. It was opened only on Saturdays and Sundays, and on those days when the film trailer arrived, collective farm meetings were convened. And dosvitki, which long ago were a kind of clubs in winter, had been revived during the German occupation and were active in almost every corner. On the farm, with grandmother Pavlicha, in Mihaliev region with the Kelembets, in Zaozir region with the Zarazoms and Bandurs, in the Baraniev region at Grandma Kalenichka's. On the second day, we went to Mykola Simonchukov, with whom Andrei had already become friends. Mykola was at home, and I barely recognized him. During the war, he had become taller than each of us. His mother was happy to treat us to a strong homemade product. It must be said that in those days, moonshine was in every house. They began to make it out of the beet fields under the Germans. In the first post-war years, the police did not really persecute moonshine brewing either. And before the war, you could have been imprisoned. Now, the home distillery often helped the peasants in their hardships. They not only drank moonshine, but also sold it, especially widows, to pay taxes. In the following days, mostly on Saturdays and Sundays, I started going with Andrei to village Dosvitki, to Pavlicha. Tetiana Apostolova, Pavlo Yosipovich Галька, Полька Погуляєва, Галька Ляхова, Галька Стрепчукова, Катерина Єлисєєва, Галка of Дмитро Галівців, and Anna Yermolina gathered there. Andrei went there for Tetiana Apostolova and dragged me along. We stayed there as a rule from evening till midnight. The girls embroidered clothes, sang songs. I also sang with them, and once the girls had a feast with drinks and snacks. All this was probably done for Andrei and Tetiana, who were about to get married, and I didn't have my girlfriend there. For some reason, none caught my eye. In the same spring, Andrei and Tetiana got married. I was at their wedding as senior boyar. Later, when their son Grisha was born, Andrei took me as his son's godfather, and he and I were on good terms all our lives. After the marriage, Andrei went to work on a collective farm, and later he was sent to study at a regional agricultural school at the expense of the collective farm, from which he graduated as a junior agronomist 2 years later and began working as a field farmer and later as a farm laborer. In his old age, he developed a stomach ulcer and died of cancer at the age of 69. Tetiana was left alone in a house that Andrei had built in the grooves. Daughter Marusia and son Grisha left home for other places. In December 1945, another frontline soldier returned home from hospital. A friend of my childhood and youth, Yegor Petrovich Samylenko. It was a great joy for me. After all, none of my closest friends were in the village. Mitrofan Hetmanev and Stepan Sokolov were still serving in the army. Ivan Movchan had died near Stalingrad, and Ivan Marechin, with his injured eye, had joined the Labor Army and was rebuilding the Donbass mines. Yegor was 6 months younger than me, and at the beginning of the war, he had not been drafted into the army, and during the occupation, he had been sent to work in Germany, but on the way, he had escaped from the echelon and had hidden with relatives. In 1943, he had been mobilized into the active army. He had been wounded in the arm at the front. Yegor's parents were very happy that their youngest son had returned from the war alive and well. After all, the elder Andrei had been taken away by the Germans and obviously shot. He had been a topographer lieutenant, got surrounded and came home, and then the SS raided, and he, as the commander of the Red Army, was immediately captured and driven to Lowitzer. It is not known where he had died, in the Gestapo or in captivity. For the first few days, I did not leave Yegor. His father himself liked to drink and knew how to treat people. He sang well and knew many old songs. And as soon as he had drunk, he started, "Oh, quiet Danube, oh, quiet Danube, ruins the banks. Oh, young Cossack, asks Ataman. Oh, let me go, you chieftain, home from the army. Oh, my girl's been crying. She's sad, the girls at home." It was said that in his youth he had been a great master of all kinds of pranks. With the same friends as himself, he had been able to get so carried away at someone's party that the whole village remembered it for a long time afterwards. For example, pull the sledge on which the father and mother were transported to a tall tree and arrange a farewell comedy with booze there. And when his eldest son, Andrei, was getting married, he gathered guests on the second day and began to feast. People drank, talked, nothing else. He put more and more alcohol, and they were just sitting there chattering. Then he shouted, "Why have you come here? Break chimneys. I'm marrying my son." The wedding itself was held according to unwritten traditional rules. The elderly played the main role there, especially women. They closely watched what and how should happen during the wedding. And the second and sometimes even the third day was spent creatively, with high spirits and inventions. Here, the most energetic, talented, and clever actors took on the main role. Nuggets, who were in every village if there was a glass of alcohol for inspiration. In the morning, gypsies, dressed accordingly and painted with soot, ran around the village. They guessed people's fortune using cards and got lard, butter, and eggs, all that was taken to the wedding parents' place where dinner was being prepared. After the feast, they dressed up the father and mother, put them in a cart or a sleigh, and drove them noisily around the village, mostly to relatives. On the way, they danced to an accordion and a tambourine. They sang wedding songs in which they praised the father and mother for their generosity. Here is one of them. "We haven't got drunk at the wedding party. We haven't been there enough. Now we will go to our father's place and let's sit by the barrel and we will drink vodka praising our father." From my childhood, I remember most the party at Nastya Babaika's when her daughter Sanka was getting married. She was carried as a wedding mother, not in a cart or sledge, but in a large wooden nightstand and directly on the sand, which was on village streets in the summer. She was sitting wearing a wreath of wild flowers. The hair was untied, and on the chest there were several necklaces made of onions. She was led by two men in harnesses, and she steered the oar as if She were riding on water. People came out of their houses and laughed, and we, a crowd of children, ran after her, kicking the dust in the street. But let's return to the main story. Since Andrei's Klonakiev stuck to Tatiana, I got closer to Yegor. In a few evenings, we went around all the dosvedkis, conducting a kind of inspection of the girls' reserve. Girls were everywhere, and they were not enough grooms. The war took them away. Some boys aged 15 to 17 were running on the streets and under the windows. Our pre-war girls no longer suited us. Some have grown old, and others have returned from Germany pregnant, including my Marusia Domashenkova. Girls we were looking at now were younger than us by 3 or 4 years, and they mostly went to the club, and some went to the Kelembets for dosvedki. Among them there were Tetiana and Melashka Lazareva, Надька Ярощукова, Катерина Пащенкова, Вірка Глайовий, Шура Бішанова, real surname Бісонова, Оленка Йосипівська, Галька Оніпчиха, Дуня Грекова, Улянка Грищівська, Галька Калимбетова, Анюта Шишова, Ольга Хоміна. They also had their boyfriends, but they were still too young, like we used to be for our pre-war girls. Those were Василь Бровків, Іван Веклин, Олексій Кургелів, Василь Люліків, Іван Кониськів, Микола Редінгер, Михайло Ляхів, Василь Дяченко, Дмитро Галівець Гриша, Михайло Клунаків, and some others. We with Yegor often found ourselves at a home feast with some girls. As potential grooms, we were treated everywhere. After all, there was enough vodka then. We visited Надька Ярощукова, Катерина Пащенкова, Анюта Шишова, Катерина Матвієнкова, and at Halka Onipchicha's place, her mother treated us to such moonshine that after it we threw up what we had eaten the day before. It was said that old Onipchicha threw some kind of herbs into the vodka in order to attract boys to her daughter. We did not go there again. At Christmas, Yegor and I went to the Padinci to visit his aunt. Like Petro Gavrilovich, she was a master of all kinds of pranks. She greeted us with proverbs. Oh, my dear and dear, I didn't expect you. What will I treat you to and treat you with? She brought in a pot of boiled potatoes and a bowl of pickles, put down a bottle of vodka. He poured and said, "This is the remaining bottle, drink it, dear guest." She just ate it herself, and we drank and ate potatoes and cucumbers, and she invited us to help ourselves. Drink, eat, and I have to take some food for the piglets out. And she disappeared behind the door. We drank a bit more. I saw that Yegor felt unhappy, but it was funny to me. I was thinking if she really was that poor, what would be next? We heard that the aunt had returned from outside and was resting in the hut. Something creaked there. Suddenly the door opened and the aunt brought in a large pan of homemade sausage and a quarter of vodka, being already completely different, tidy, cheerful. And now, she said, we will drink and we will walk, and when death comes, we will die. She wished us a Merry Christmas and a safe return from the war. She poured out a full glass and added, "Excuse me for the cucumbers and potatoes. I like to joke." Meanwhile, her daughter Katerina ran into the house. The aunt had sent for her somewhere as she was going outside and had not taken any food for the piglets out. A new snack also appeared on the table: sour cream, jelly, white pies. We recharged well. And in the evening, Katya, who was 18 years old, took us to Dosvedki. There, as in Yashniki, there were a lot of girls and 2 or 3 boys. We stayed there. I sang more with the girls, and Yegor was telling something funny. But for some reason, we did not like any of the Zapadinci beauties. Some of them were too old, Others were weak, and the rest of them were still too young. They invited us to the New Year party. We promised to come, but we did not keep our word.